Hello there, welcome back to another rebuild series. Today we're going to be working on a Ford 6R140. It's out of a 2018 F750 water truck with a PTO, so 6.7 diesel. And basically the story here is that this transmission is actually a Ford remanufactured unit that was warranted or part of a warranty deal for the customer, and it failed within 300 miles of him installing it. So he was going back and forth with Ford on multiple different warranty units out of the various vehicles in his fleet. He's a contractor, owns a construction company, and he's gotten to the point where it's just, entirely too frustrating to keep warranting these things out every so often. I mean, on average, he told me that these transmissions are lasting literally like 6 months. A couple of them overheating due to the thermal bypass valves in the valve body just sticking shut, restricting fluid flow, causing the whole thing to cook off inside. So anyway, this is going to be a comprehensive overhaul. It's going to be more or less stock. We're not doing any crazy upgrades or anything like that. So for those watching, if you're looking for something to kind of follow that's just a stock but what I would call thorough base level build, this would be a good video series for you. So we're going to be replacing all soft parts, a couple hard parts that were required as well. We'll get into that a little bit later when we start going through the sub-assemblies. But suffice to say, the one thing that I'll mention straight away with these transmissions is if you're going to work on them for the first time, or you're thinking about getting into them, you are going to need to make a sizable capital expenditure in tooling and equipment. Okay, they are not light on the specialized tooling. And first and foremost, you're going to need either a super sturdy bench with an appropriate mounting fixture, or an engine stand that ideally has a gear crank. You really don't want the kind of stand that most people have, where you have to manipulate the engine or the trans or whatever that you have bolted to it by hand, because this transmission is just simply too heavy to do, at least by yourself. And the assumption here is that you're going to be working by yourself. At least that's how I set up all my videos, all my builds, everything I do in the shop. I do it alone. There's no help, or at least I haven't hired help to assist me with anything. So anyway, we'll get a little bit closer to the bench. I'll cover all the special tools as we are working on each of the sub-assemblies that require them, as well as the main case. You'll see those in detail. Maybe I'll do like a special dedicated video to tooling after this build is done, but suffice to say, there is quite a lot of tools that you'll be using during the course of this rebuild. Alright, so we have all of our bolts and small parts here on the rag, and just working from right side of the bench to left, I'll just cover everything in brief that we're going to be installing. First thing you're probably noticing is the new output shaft nut. I always like to replace those on overhaul. I've built these before, reusing the nut, never had any adverse effects, but a lot of times you have to heat that nut up so much that it does warrant replacement, especially if you're using an oxyacetylene torch. But it's just a matter of practice or habit with me. I mean, they're not super expensive. I want to say they're about 50-60 bucks, and it's just good assurance that the nut hasn't fatigued in any way. And so that's why I choose to replace them all. Alright, the kit that we're going to be installing this transmission is going to basically be a factory spec banner kit. So it's going to consist of a Borg-Warner clutch module, a factory spec steel module, paper and rubber kit, a bonded piston set, as well as a whole bunch of oil seals for the various applications that take seals at the front of the rear. I mean, you're going to have your main pump seal, but then the 4x4 units have their own seal. The two-wheel drives with the slip yokes have seals. There's just different seals, so the kit will come with that. The other thing I recommend you do is purchase an additional sealing ring kit separately, so that you have a little bit of redundancy, some extras in the event you break a sealing ring when you're installing, either dressing the PTO gear or sealing rings on the stator shaft for the pump or the input shaft. Most of the sealing rings are going to be very easy to deal with, assuming you have all the correct tools, but the PTO gear can be a little tricky. And so if you're working on a PTO, I would definitely recommend you get another sealing ring kit, just to have those 2 extra rings in that kit in the event you break one of them back with the installation. So All right, we had to replace a few hard parts in this thing as well. The pump housing. So when you have a catastrophic applied element failure, a lot of times the housing here will get heavily scored up, and that's what happened with this original unit. So we got an equivalent, good used, it's in perfect shape. So that's what we're going to install and marry it to the rest of the original components from the pump, including the body, the PTO gear, and the stator support assembly. Alright, I'm also going to replace all the electrical components in the transmission, so your 2 speed sensors, your range position switch, your wiring harness, as well as all the solenoids on the valve body. Now, the valve body in this thing was also no good. It was not rebuildable. At least, unfortunately, Sonics doesn't have 3.5R clutch regulator valve reamers in stock, so I couldn't purchase one. That's literally the only thing wrong with it, but I'm dead in the water with the vacuum signal I was receiving. I have a video on that was published about a week or so before this one, so if you're curious as to the details, you could check it out. But the point being is that I can't let it go out the door like that, because I believe that 3.5R regulator valve was the proximate cause for the extreme failure and burn down of that clutch in this transmission. Again, only 300 miles on it, so you know, pretty severe. New trans temperature sensor you see there on the bench, whole bunch of seals for the valve body, and then, you know, of course, all your paper and rubber for everything else. All right, what else? I'm going to move down the bench a little bit. We'll talk a little about the rest of the case components. Not really a lot to say, just a couple things that you want to have top of mind before you begin your 6R140 rebuild, if it's, you know, going to be the first time you're going back to, you know, with one of these units. All right, here we see the rest of the internals. In this transmission, I had to replace both the 3.5R and 1, 2, 3, 4 ply pistons, as well as the drum, the 3.5R drum. So I originally suspected that the drum that came in with this unit was bad. It was leaking at the base welds. That's what I thought. Once I got my checking tool in, I tested it. It actually passed the test, but I had already purchased a new drum, and so customer wants the drum. There's no reason not to install it at this point. It's brand new, and you know, that's what we're going to move forward with. So a couple things you want to have top of mind when preparing for your rebuild. First, you want to make sure you have at least 2 different snap rings for each of the clutch packs other than low reverse, which doesn't take one. So your 1, 2, 3, 4 and your 2, 6 clutch, aka your forward and your intermediate clutch, use the same clutch snap ring. And you can tell which snap ring is which based on how the ends look. So those 2 clutch packs, they only have one notch here, or one one notch at the end of the snap ring. The other one's squared off. For your 3.5R clutch, or your direct clutch, you have 2 notches, and they look just like this. So you know this is for the 3.5R clutch pack. Okay, 4, 5, 6, aka overdrive, pretty self-explanatory. It's much smaller than the others. And then as far as selectives inside the case itself, there's going to be 2. You're going to have a selective for your front sun gear, and that basically sets your front end play. So it's going to be this right here. Unfortunately, I do not have another thickness, and the supplier did not have any different thicknesses either. So no reason for me to suspect end play would be materially different versus now versus when the transmission came in. Nothing in the front of the unit that you know, directly affects end play, as well as the case itself, was replaced. Only the 3.5R drum, and that has nothing to do with front end play in these transmissions. It has no effect on it, I should say. The other selective you want to have handy is going to be the rear spacer. So we have a couple of different thicknesses here, 110 and 120 thousandths. And we also have the original spacer that came out of the unit at 127 thousandths. So it goes on this bearing that interfaces with the top sun gear in the rear planing. Alright, let's talk a little bit about the case. Not a whole lot to say about it other than just a couple things I wanted to point out. Okay, So if you have a PTO unit come in, you want to make sure you scrutinize the threads here on the PTO housing, or PTO hookup. In the case of this transmission, at least 2 of these helicoil inserts were actually coming out. They were walking out, and I was pushing against the inboard gasket here, causing it to leak. At least that's my suspicion. The customer didn't state one way or another, but I just had to go to the machine shop to have 5 out of these 6 repaired. The other one, whichever one it was, perfectly fine, but the other 5 needed to be completely redone. You want to check the case for any cracks, any scoring at sealing surfaces like your wiring harness port there, and then you also want to scrutinize the needle bearing assemblies at the very back of the case. There's 2 of them, they're exactly the same, and every once in a while you'll get one in where one of the needles is missing in either one or both assemblies, and if that's the case, my default is to replace both of them, and you can just get them from Ford. So there is a special tool to drive them out. I don't have it on the bench. The needle bearing assemblies in this unit are perfectly fine, but if I have a picture, I'll flash it across the screen to show you what that looks like and how it's done. Alright, the only other things you want to scrutinize are all the other threads, threaded bowl hole locations, pump to case, valve body, parking, parking pole guide plate, the thread for your detent roller, and so forth. Extension housing, thread bolts, or locations. You just want to check to make sure that they're not boogered up, and if they are, just have them repaired via helicoil. Alright, so let me go ahead and stage everything on the bench. We're going to work on the pump first, get that going. We'll walk you through the entire assembly. We'll show the dressing and installation of the sealing rings, and then the process that you need to follow to put it all back together. And then we'll move on to the 3.5R and 4.5/6 drum, and then eventually the 2.6 low reverse. And then at that point we'll be ready to put everything into the case, bolt the valve body on, and pan, filter, and be done with it. Alright, we have everything assembled as far as parts and tools to go ahead and put the pump assembly back together. So cover a couple of things from an inspection perspective first, and then we'll go ahead and proceed with the assembly. So I'll start with the pump body. It's going to be probably your most sensitive part, followed by the housing and then the stator support. So like all pumps, and this one's no different, you have both a set of working surfaces you need to inspect, as well as a set of clearances, clearance specifications that you need to be within. So first we'll start with the inspection. So unlike most transmissions, these pumps don't take a bushing, they take a needle bearing assembly. So it's not usually necessary to replace this unless the whole transmission overheated, the torque converter suffered a massive failure, and it maybe partially melted the bearing cage in here, which is plastic. So if that's the case, then it might be actually prudent to replace the whole pump body or even the entire pump assembly, depending on the severity of the failure. But that notwithstanding, first thing you want to do is take off all of the old seal material here. There's like sealing compound, and it'll cake itself all over the inner diameter as well as the face here. You could do that with like an angle grinder and a wafer pad or whatever, maybe sandpaper. As long as it's all gone, or mostly gone, I guess I still have to clean up a little bit, that the new seal will install, and there will be 100% seal between the inner diameter here as well as the face here. Nothing will leak there. Okay, next thing you want to do is inspect all your threads, and then start inspecting your working surfaces, including your priming crescent and your base for any kind of scoring. Okay, scoring here would indicate problems with either engine main bearings, especially if it's heavily worn on one side, or just contaminant and debris circulating throughout the transmission for a long period of time. Now, this thing only has 300 miles on it, and while this has some witness marks from the driven gear, you can't feel any of this. Okay, if you can see it but you can't feel it, it's fine. Okay, same with right here. There's a lot of times you'll see wear between the suction and pressure ports. You want to check that as well. Again, this pump is fine. And you can get a good idea as to pump health at a glance when you take the transmission apart and you look at all the clutch packs. If they're all in good shape, other than maybe one failure like of the which we had here, the 35R in this case, then it's probably a decent bet that the pump is okay. So when it comes to clearances, you're going to manage to 3 primary measurements. Okay, there's going to be the outer diameter of the driven gear, to the inner diameter of the body, okay, the bore. Then you're going to have your drive gear to crescent, and then you're going to have your gear face to the deck surface. So the clearances you want to be within are as follows. Gear face to deck, 5/10,000ths to 1/1000th of an inch. Drive gear to crescent, 3 to 6/1000ths. And outer diameter of the driven gear to the inner diameter of the pocket, 3 to 6/1000ths. So we'll measure the latter 2 first, and then we'll measure the deck clearance. Alright, so 3/1000ths. Sorry about that. Okay, fits nice and snug. I would say this measurement is probably 3 to at most 3.5 thou, just, you know, based on feel. And then 6/1000ths. It fits down here, but it's getting pinched up in here to the point where I can't move it. So I know I'm between 3 and 6/1000ths there. Alright, let's check the outer diameter of the driven gear against the inner pocket wall. Oop. Okay, this fits all the way around, and I'm able to move it relatively easily. 6. Okay. It's starting to pinch, so I know that we're between 3 and 6. Alright, now we have a 1 thou feeler gauge. This is the thinnest feeler gauge I have. So you can turn your gears just to make sure that they do spin freely underneath the straight edge. If they're not making contact with the straight edge, that would mean that these gears themselves are, you know, somehow misshapen, likely due to excessive wear, contaminant, particulate matter passing through them over and over and over again, causing some spots to kind of raise up a little bit. So if you encounter that, just replace the pump. Okay, this is going through, but it's dragging. Both sides are making contact with the straight edge and gear face respectively. Alright, so dots will always face up, and that's how you measure your clearances. So now what we need to do is put a seal in here. I gotta clean the rest of this crap off, and then we'll put a seal in. This here, this port right here is going to be your alignment dowel location on for the alignment dowel on the pump housing, and then this here, this is your drain back. Okay, you always want to check to make sure that there's no obstructions in there, and there's no obstructions in you know, debris in the little port for the alignment dowel. Alright, we have our old seal and our new seal, and then we have the inner pocket cleaned up as much as possible. So part number on this thing is going to be BC3P7A2. That's right there. Okay, I mean, you can tell just match them up visually. And then the driver I'm going to be using, it's going to be a Kent Moore tool for 6L80s, DT47866. This installs the bearing in the 3.5R drum in those transmissions. The handle is Kent Moore J8092. So I'm going to put this on the floor on a towel, and then I'll go ahead and smack the seal home. Now we're ready to install the gears for the final time under the pump body or into it. So a little assembly lube. Just heavily coat all your surfaces. Would also get the bearing. The seal itself comes already lubed up with whatever, whatever Ford puts on there. But you could put assembly lube on it too if you want. So we have our driven gear. Alright, and the same holds true with the witness marks or the visual, scoring pattern. If you can't feel it, which I cannot feel anything when I'm running my fingernail over the driven or drive gear, then it does not need to be replaced as long as it's within spec. Okay, and that applies to both gear sets, or I should say both gears rather. Okay, light coating here on the face, and get the splines if you want. And then we'll go ahead and put our O-ring. Now, if you purchase a reman pump from Transtar or elsewhere in the aftermarket, you need to take the pump apart and fully dress it. They do not come with any sealing rings, nor do they come with the body O-ring or the housing O-ring. So you want to make sure that this white stripe is facing out all the way around. If you fail to install this particular O-ring here on the body, you will not have third, fifth, and reverse gear because this it acts as a boundary for that apply circuit. So they're not drop-in ready, unfortunately, is what it is. Alright, so we'll set the body aside and then now we'll focus on the housing. Get my tools organized here. So from an inspection perspective, you just want to check all the way around on the working surface. Make sure that you cannot feel any scoring. Again, same rule applies. Witness marks are fine, but if you can feel and get your fingernail caught up or hung up in any of the scoring patterns that you see on the surface, then you need to replace this thing. Let me give you an example. So here is the original housing that came in with the unit, and as you can see, it's got a lot more pronounced scoring here in this area. And while I know you can't feel it through a video, if you were to run your fingernail across this entire area, it would get caught up quite easily. So I don't have a source to machine these housings. I was talking with another customer who's also a machinist. He does a lot of engine building, and we had kind of examined the housing and determined what kind of machine work would be required to get this thing to where it's serviceable again and how to do it. And I mean, I'm not a machinist, so he was kind of talking a bit over my head, but at the same time he was very clear in terms of like the procedures that he explained and how he would machine this surface to be perfectly true and flat again. All right, so the other thing I want to point out is the differences between PTO housings and non-PTO housings. So your PTO housing is going to have this steel insert here, the steel sleeve, and you want to make sure that it's free of scoring or ring cut or ring grooving, and you also want to make sure that it's still aligned with this big port here. Okay, if it's not, and you know it gets turned around in there, then either you're going to have to somehow get it back in alignment, assuming it's still usable, but more than likely, if that sleeve has turned on you, the housing is simply no good. All right, the third thing I'll mention is this little drain back valve here. Okay, those started going into these pumps, I want to say in 2013. They started putting this little valve in here. So your kit should come with a replacement. But if not, then just simply extract the one that came in with the pump and check it over to make sure it's still okay. So here's the one that came in the kit. It's brand new. That's what we're going to install. I'm going to clean out the little pocket there real quick off camera, and then we'll proceed. So the pump O-ring for the housing goes on the other side of it, just right here. So this one still has the old O-ring on it. So, I mean, my gloves are not capable of removing it, but you want to check here the surface for your gasket. Yeah, that steel, for lack of a better term, gasket that goes here. Make sure that none of the worm tracks are scored up in any way, that there's not any potential for cross leaks other than where they're already notched from the factory. And then just check the housing over in general. It's got a little bit of, I don't know, something going on there, but it's not consequential. All right, for reference's sake, this is a housing for a non-PTO application. As you see, it has no steel insert, but it still has the big port right there and the little drain back valve. So a quick and easy way to identify the differences visually at a glance if you're at the hard part supplier, the yard, or wherever you might be getting your hard parts from, so that you don't inadvertently buy the wrong housing. The bodies are all the same, the housings are different, and the stator shaft, stator support assemblies are different. All right, let me clean that up, and then we'll go ahead and do what we need to do with the housing and the PTO gear, because we're all set to basically finish this thing. Here's the old one. And then for our O-ring, just put it on. You want to have the red stripe facing out toward you. Pretty simple. Make sure it's like that all the way around. Okay, once it is, you can put the housing to the side so we can focus on the gear. Alright, so here's a PTO gear. It's going to take 2 sealing rings and an O-ring, and I have to bring the O-ring onto the bench. So the bearing is going to go on just like this. It can't really go any other way. I mean, it just won't fit. So I'm going to stick it in Mercon LV for a minute, let it soak in nicely, and then we'll put it on once we're done with the PTO gear. Alright, here's a little O-ring. It's going to go here. We're going to put that on last. First, we need to install our 2 sealing rings. So here's a special installer, expander, and sizer tool, or tool set I should say. The expander is OTC 307659/1. The sizer is 307659/2. I get a lot of questions about the special tools I use, and my answer is always the same when it comes to where to get them, because that's actually the preponderance of the inquiries. And you know, I'll tell you guys the same thing I tell everybody else, and that is I get them on eBay. Okay, that is going to be your best bet for sourcing these tools. sure this is all the way out. It is. Okay. All right, there we go. So you want to make sure that your expander is such that you have basically no gap between the bottom of the expander and the sealing ring groove. Just go ahead and coat the tool with some assembly lube. Make it easy for the sealing rings to slide over, because they're going to take most of the assembly lube with them, so that you don't have to worry about breaking one of them. That wasn't fully seated, so just carefully go all the way around. And like I said, of all the sealing rings in this transmission, the PTO sealing rings are the trickiest by far to install. And as far as, risk of breaking one, it's by far the highest during this procedure. The risk, that is, that you break one. Alright. So do the best you can to size it, just using your hands, hands and fingers. Get it ready to receive the sizing tool. Okay, the end that's facing you now, that's the end that's going to go down, and size the rings to fit. Okay, just know that, maybe you get lucky, but know that you're probably going to have to work on these things a little bit. So it's not likely you're going to get it to size on the first shot. Let's see what's going on here. And this is kind of unusual for the tool to be behaving. And sometimes you just have to go part way and kind of partially size it, take the tool off, and then go back with it again multiple times until you fully seat it and you size that sealing ring. So I just have to go around a whole bunch of times to get it fully, inside of the tool, so that the sealing ring doesn't get destroyed when I, fully install the tool and seat it as far as it'll go. Alright, now it's fully seated. So what I'm going to do is just leave it there for about 15 minutes, and then we'll come back and check it and see if that works. Alright, let's check. It's going to be kind of difficult to get under here. This thing is basically on there as tight as can be. Gotta get a little bit of daylight so we can get our pry bar here. I'm gonna start a screwdriver. All right, comes the pry bar. All right, let's test it now in the housing. All right, there we go. Make sure it's spinning nice and freely. And then once you're ready, go ahead and remove it. Grab your other sealing ring and your expansion tool. Okay, looks good. I want to make sure I get assembly lube all the way around across the entire surface of this thing. I think on that first ring there were spots that were dry and that was causing the ring to want to hang up a little bit. All right. Alright, do the best you can to size it by hand. This top ring is nowhere near as ornery as that bottom one. Alright, the other sets of sealing rings on the input shaft and the stator shaft are relatively easy by comparison. Now, some of you are probably wondering, well, why the hell didn't you just simply leave the original sealing rings in place? Well, on a unit with 300 miles on it, that's actually a reasonable question. And you could do that assuming Ford replaced these sealing rings during their reman process. But you would be making an assumption that that's what they did unless you knew for a fact. And I don't know if that's what they do or not. Given what I've already seen in terms of what kind of valve bodies they let go out the door, I don't want to make any assumptions at all. So there's no way for me to test these sealing rings in any way to see if they're holding pressure or sealing against this sleeve as they should. I mean, there's no way for me to do it. So I just simply have to assume that they were not replaced and replace them with new. I mean, that's what you should do for any overhaul. Any kind of consumable part like this should always be replaced. Alright, let's see. Alright, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to go all the way around and kind of let the weight of the gear collapse the sealing ring inboard toward the tool until I get it all the way seated and started so that no part of it is protruding. And I'll come here and I'll start working it. So I want to double check all the way around. Okay, I'm looking for any signs of broken sealing ring, any pieces of it or whatever. Alright, go all the way down with it. And once again, let them sit. And then while these rings are cooking, so to speak, we'll go ahead and go over the stator support assembly real quick. So points of inspection are pretty basic. You're going to check splines. You're going to check splines back here. I replaced this bushing, so a lot of times it's wore out. Check inner diameter for sealing ring groove cut for the input shaft sealing rings. Check your journals. Want to make sure this surface is perfectly flat. So you could take your straight edge, your 1 thou feeler gauge, and see if you can stick it underneath the straight edge, through and through, which I cannot. I already tried this. I mean, it'll go under, but I could feel the straight edge starting to move a little bit. You could also use a flashlight and shine it behind the straight edge underneath to see if you see light poking through. Right there, it's a little not flat, but that's not going to hurt anything. This is where the gears work, right along this surface, particularly the drive gear. So this is the area you want flat. The rest of it, if it's ever so slightly got maybe the ability to pass a 1/2 thou feeler gauge through it, that half should go away once you bolt everything back together. Alright, now let me show you what stator support assembly looks like for a non-PTO unit, because they are different. Alright, so you notice here you have a much larger journal, a spot for an O-ring, and a spot for a Teflon sealing ring that does not exist on the PTO stator. So that's going to be your main differences. So the rest of the hydraulic circuitry, the channels through, they're all the same. Here's the back half of it. Bushing. I mean, all these journals are the same diameter. I mean, everything is the same except for this portion right here. All right, I'm gonna wait another 10 minutes and then we'll take the gear, get that sizer off of it, and then install it onto the pump housing, put the bearing on, and then gasket and bolt the stator support assembly to the housing and body. And so you'll see how we do that. All right, let's check. It's going to be kind of difficult to get under here. I mean, this thing is basically on there as tight as can be. Gotta get a little bit of daylight so we can get our pry bar here. Start a screwdriver. Alright, come with the pry bar. Alright, let's test it now in the housing. Alright, there we go. Make sure it's spinning nice and freely. And then once you're ready, go ahead and remove it. Grab your other sealing ring and your expansion tool. Okay, looks good. want to make sure I get assembly lube all the way around across the entire surface of this thing. I think on that first ring there were spots that were dry, and that was causing the ring to want to hang up a little bit. All right. All right, do the best you can to size it by hand. This top ring is nowhere near as ornery as that bottom one. Alright, the other sets of sealing rings on the input shaft and the stator shaft are relatively easy by comparison. Now, some of you are probably wondering, well, why the hell didn't you just simply leave the original sealing rings in place? Well, on a unit with 300 miles on it, that's actually a reasonable question. And you could do that assuming Ford replaced these sealing rings during their reman process. But you would be making an assumption that that's what they did unless you knew for a fact. And I don't know if that's what they do or not. Given what I've already seen in terms of what they, what kind of valve bodies they let go out the door, I don't want to make any assumptions at all. So there's no way for me to test these sealing rings in any way to see if they're holding pressure or sealing against this sleeve as they should. I mean, there's no way for me to do it. So I just simply have to assume that they were not replaced and replace them with new. I mean, that's what you should do for any overhaul. Any kind of consumable part like this should always be replaced. All right, let's see. Alright, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to go all the way around and kind of let the weight of the gear collapse the sealing ring inboard toward the tool until I get it all the way seated and started so that no part of it is protruding. And I'll come here and I'll start working it. Just want to double check all the way around. Okay, I'm looking for any signs of broken sealing ring, any pieces of it or whatever. Alright, go all the way down with it. And once again, let them sit. And then while these rings are cooking, so to speak, we'll go ahead and go over the stator support assembly real quick. So points of inspection are pretty basic. You're going to check splines. You're going to check splines back here. I replaced this bushing, so a lot of times it's wore out. Check inner diameter for sealing ring groove cut for the input shaft sealing rings. Check your journals. Want to make sure this surface is perfectly flat. So you could take your straight edge, your 1 thou feeler gauge, and see if you can stick it underneath the straight edge, through and through, which I cannot. I already tried this. I mean, it'll go under, but I could feel the straight edge starting to move a little bit. You could also use a flashlight and shine it behind the straight edge underneath to see if you see light poking through. right there it's a little not flat, but that's not going to hurt anything. This is where the gears work, right along this surface, particularly the drive gear. So this is the area you want flat. The rest of it, if it's ever so slightly got maybe the ability to pass a half a thou feeler gauge through it, that half should go away once you bolt everything back together. Alright, now let me show you what stator support assembly looks like for a non-PTO unit, because they are different. Alright, so you notice here you have a much larger journal, a spot for an O-ring, and a spot for a Teflon sealing ring that does not exist on the PTO stator. So that's going to be your main differences. So the rest of the you know, hydraulic circuitry, the channels through, they're all the same. Here's the back half of it. You know, bushing. I mean, all these journals are the same diameter. I mean, everything is the same except for this portion right here. All right, I'm gonna wait another 10 minutes and then we'll take the gear, get that sizer off of it, and then install it onto the pump housing, put the bearing on, and then gasket and bolt the stator support assembly to the housing and body. And so you'll see how we do that. Alright, so the first thing I want to do is actually mate the body with the housing. So we'll give the gear and the sealing rings a few more minutes to kind of resize and get nice and tight in their grooves so that we have no issues installing the gear through the housing here with the sealing rings mated to the sleeve. So here's our alignment dial location. Here's the alignment dial on the pump, or the housing I should say, or pump cover. So we'll go ahead and lube up all the working surfaces and sealing surfaces so that we're ready to go. Sorry, that was not quite in the view entirely. Alright. Let me lube up the O-ring on the pump body. I want a dry O-ring, that will cause all kind of problems. What I'm doing is I'm just checking rotation of the gears, making sure nothing got boogered up in there. And we can come around to the front side to make sure it's fully seated. Okay, we're going to air check the 3.5R clutch. Once that drum is fully assembled, we're going to check it through the pump so that we can confirm or deny that our you know, our installation was good, you know, pump body into housing, and that we didn't break or cut or lacerate that that O-ring. Because if we did, we'll know it. We won't have any apply whatsoever, because we'll check the drum independently first with a checking tool, and then we'll air check through the pump. Alright. I doubt very much this little stand is going to be tall enough to allow me to install the stator support assembly, so I may have to actually move this whole deal to the other bench where there's a hole. In fact, that's what I know I'm going to have to do. So let me move the camera over there, get everything situated, and then we'll finish up the pump assembly. Okay, so let's go ahead and situate our body housing assembly onto our little stand. And then now we got to take off that sizing tool from our gear so that we can install it. Gotta be constantly checking camera angles because you never know when I'm gonna not have something in view that needs to be within view. Alright, I want to throw my O-ring on here very quickly. Lube it up. Lube up the inner diameter. There's also a bearing in here you want to check. Make sure that it's good to go. Same with all the teeth. And then once you realize it is, go ahead, lube it up, and then install your PTO gear for the final time. Alright. Settles nicely into place. Let's get that bearing. So Mercon LV fluid is what you want to soak everything in if you're going to soak your clutches and all your bearings and everything else, planets. I got a big bucket of this stuff on the other side of the bench so that I can put the planets in there prior to installation. Okay, there's your bearing. Alright, now our metal gasket. So 2 alignment dowels right here. And then our stator support. What I'm doing is checking to see to make sure the hole in the bench is aligned so that this thing won't get hung up. Nope. It's good. It's actually not long enough to reach, so we're fine. So right here, it's going to get hung up on the alignment dowel. That's fine. Just check it all the way around. And then progressively tap it home. Check your PTO gear. Make sure it spins. Let me get this fluid out of the way. Last thing we need is a major accident. Okay, bowl locations. So you're going to have 7 long bolts that are going to go through the entire stator support into the body. And they're going to go in these locations here where I'm showing. And then you're going to have the remainder for your short bolts. 18 foot-pounds on all these bolts, and then just go in kind of a inside to outside / crisscross pattern so that you torque everything down as evenly as possible. Alright, what I'm doing, I'm just double checking all the way around, make sure that the stator's fully flush against the housing and the gasket. And there's a little bit of a gap, but that'll be taken up when we zip these bolts down. $10mm. I shifted the camera a little bit to my right so that I had better access. Alright, let's see, I actually want to start over here. So 18 foot-pounds, just going to kind of take the whole housing against my belly, give me good leverage. So you're basically torquing all of the stator to body bolts first, and then you're going to work progressively out to the stator support to housing bolts. The ATSG manual does not have a prescribed tightening or torquing sequence. They just tell you to go in a crisscross pattern. That's basically it. Batteries are running low, so I need to get these last few pretty quickly here. All right, last bolt. All right, make sure that PTO gear is spinning nice and freely. Go around with it a bunch of times. All right, so now all we have to do is install our sealing rings, and that'll be it for the pump. So largely the same procedure as what you saw with the PTO sealing rings. Just go ahead and lather up your expander. This is an Adaptacase tool. So Adaptacase sells two different sealing ring tool sets for this transmission. The stator, which is going to be your expander and your sizer, and then for the input shaft, the same two tools, expander and resizer. And let me tell you, they are not cheap. Unfortunately, I want to say each tool is like $550 for, you know, like these two tools right here you see, $550. And just does one thing, and that's expand and install sealing rings on the stator shaft of the pump. Very expensive, but if you're going to do 6R140s, these tools make the job a whole lot easier, more efficient, and with much reduced risk. And for those that are building for a living, the name of the game is risk mitigation and efficiency in production. So yeah, the capital expenditure, the outlay that you're incurring to acquire these tools is pretty obscene when you start to think about it from a break-even analysis perspective. The amount of jobs that you'll have to do before these tools pay for themselves and then start making you money relative to whatever alternatives or improvisational methods you may use. Once you start figuring in the risk, I mean, it's a no-brainer to acquire them. And then they make quick work of the job and of these sealing rings. And like I said, these and the input shaft rings are very straightforward. Those PTO rings, man, they will absolutely put you to the test. The total amount of time that I spent just on those two sealing rings is close to 20 minutes. As I'm filming this live, I don't know how much of that you're going to see. It's not going to be anywhere near the amount of time it took me to get it done, but I'll show you what I need to show you so that A, you can see the sealing rings being installed, and B, maybe get a little bit of an idea as to how cumbersome they can be. This one, like I mentioned a little bit earlier, assuming that I keep that particular portion where I mention it, this particular pump's PTO gear is the most ornery and difficult of any 6R140 I have ever done. So chances are, if you're rebuilding your own and it's a PTO unit and you have these tools, it won't be as difficult, it won't take you nearly as long. But the main thing is you can't get impatient. You know, you can't kind of go on tilt, so to speak, if the thing is fighting you. You got to back off, step away, figure out what's happening, you know, reset, collapse the sealing ring so that it's fully inside the inner diameter of the tool, and then, you know, attack it again and do it methodically so that you don't break your sealing rings. Oops, I went a bit too far with that. There we go. In this tool, I don't think it matters which way, you orient it. All right. So what I'm going to do is let that tool just sit there until I'm ready to install the pump into the case, or at least to air check the 3.5R clutch drum so that those sealing rings don't become a problem at that point. So if you have your torque converter or a checking tool, you can go ahead and verify that the pump gears are turning as they should prior to going back with it onto the case. So this is just an old 6R140 converter hub that my machinist kind of prepped for me so that I can use it for just this purpose. So I'm going to go spin all the way around. So you have 3 sets of splines engaging here. You have your PTO splines, and then you have your splines for the drive gear. And there we go. Now it's all the way in. Okay, multiple revolutions just to be on the safe side, and then once I'm ready to drop the pump into the case for the final time, assuming I gotta do some swapping of that selective spacer and on the sun gear. Once it's installed for the final time, with the case still inverted, I'm gonna go ahead and pour some transmission fluid into here. And then, that'll prime the pump so that it's ready to go when the time comes to, fire up the vehicle. Torque converter will also be filled with about 1/4 to of fluid, at least that's what I always recommend. And so you will have no concerns about a dry start, either for the converter or for the pump assembly.